Chapter 10. An Unwelcome Gift. "You girls, listen to me," the old lady shouted. "The house you want is over in the next township, just outside of Milford. Go right down Elm Road. You can't miss it." The woman standing by the hedge shook her head. "I never heard you mention that place before, Mother." The old lady's black eyes snapped. "I know lots I don't tell," she said. The girls thanked the two women and drove off, excited at the lead. But as they neared the small town of Milford, Bess looked worried. "I'm beginning to wish I'd stayed home," she said. "I really don't want to meet any kidnappers." "Now don't be a snob," George teased her cousin. "It's all right for you to make jokes," Bess replied. "But I can't help it if I'm not brave like you two." Nancy smiled. "I can remember times on some of my cases when you were way ahead of us." "I surprised myself," Bess admitted. Nancy spotted the sign marking Elm Road and turned into the narrow, treeless street. "There it is!" exclaimed George. In the middle of the block was a yard full of bluebells. "You mean there it isn't," Nancy said gloomily, as she pulled up in front of the white cottage. A faded sign, "Bluebell House," hung by the door. No mansion, no fence, no gate. "But whoever lives here must be interested in bluebells," said Bess. "Maybe they could help you." "Good idea," Nancy said, and the three girls went up the walk to the door. Their knock was answered by a thin young woman wearing an apron. "Hello, girls," she said cheerfully. "I guess you want to see the china. Come on in." She walked quickly into a room off the hall, beckoning them to follow. Nancy tried to explain, but stopped short at the door of the room. Shelves and tables were filled with flowered china. "All hand-painted," the girl said. "The prices are marked." "Oh, how beautiful!" Bess exclaimed. While she and George looked around, Nancy explained to the girl why they had called. "There's no place like that around Milford," she said. "But have you tried the Brookdale section of River Heights? I've heard there used to be lots of estates out that way." Nancy thanked her, and Bess bought 3 hand-painted cups and saucers. "There's one for each of us," she said when they reached the car. "A souvenir of a wild goose chase." "It may not have been so hopeless after all," said Nancy, and repeated what the girl had said. George looked thoughtful. "You told us Dr. Spire rode about an hour to get to the house. Can't we narrow the search by going only to places that are about an hour from the road where the old sedan was parked?" "We could," Nancy said, "but the chances are that the kidnappers drove a little longer than necessary just to confuse the doctor." George grinned. "Nancy, you never miss a trick." A further search continued for some time, but without success. Finally, Bess reminded Nancy of the dance that night. "We'd better go home," she advised. Hours later, Nancy was seated with Ned on a bench outside the gaily lighted porch of the yacht club. Lively music and singing came pulsing out the wide-open doors and windows. "On a hunch, I brought something for the chemistry expert," she said, and handed him the envelope containing the bits of paper she had picked up in the woods. "I'm no expert," he protested. Ned's eyes filled with mischief. "You don't expect me to look at this, do you, when I could be looking at you?" Nancy blushed and laughed. She was wearing a simple rose-colored formal, and her hair was piled high with a gardenia tucked in it. "Please be serious," she said. "I have a hunch that the burning circle is made of fireworks, which are carried by someone. I remembered that you once helped make a fireworks display at college." Ned spilled the bits of paper into his palm. He looked at them carefully. "Your hunch is right, Nancy. These are fragments of quick match." "What's that?" she asked. "The fuse which is used to light fireworks." He explained that it was a string coated with a mixture of gunpowder and glue and enclosed in a brown paper tube. Then that's attached to the lances. And what are they? Nancy queried. Paper tubes filled with chemical mixtures which burn different colors. The circle you saw is probably a wooden frame with long nails sticking out of it, about an inch apart. The lances are forced upright onto the points of the nails. Then the quick match is nailed across the tops of the lances. It's rough to do, he added, because the lances are very hard, and many times the nail goes into your finger instead. Well, does that help you? Yes. If I can find out where the fireworks were bought and by whom, I may have a good lead. The rest of the evening was pure fun and ended with supper on several of the members' yachts moored to the club's dock. While taking their dates home, the three boys invited them to a swimming meet at the camp the next afternoon, and the invitation was accepted. By 1 o'clock, the girls were ready for bed. Bess and George dropped off to sleep at once, but Nancy lay awake. Suddenly, she sat up. There had been a noise downstairs. Quickly, she put on robe and slippers, then grabbed a flashlight from her suitcase. Slipping past her sleeping friends, Nancy went quietly down the back stairs. At the bottom, she heard a scraping sound in the utility room. Softly, she opened the door and flashed on her light. Caught in the beam was a white-faced, frightened figure on his hands and knees. He looked up. The missing man! "Morgan!" Nancy exclaimed. "What are you doing? Where have you been?" I dropped the door key," he stammered. Nancy spotted the key and picked it up. "Thank you. I was moving things, feeling around for it. Sorry I disturbed you." "Morgan, we've been very worried about you," Nancy said. "Won't you please tell me what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," the man said quickly. "I'll explain in the morning." He opened the door to his bedroom, stepped inside, and locked the door behind him. Nancy wondered if she should awaken her hostess to report the servant's return, but decided against this. In the morning, before breakfast, Mrs. Corning told the girls Morgan had already talked to her and her husband. She said he had begged forgiveness and had told a rambling story about going to help a friend. "I'm afraid it's not true, but we don't want to discharge him," she sighed, then said, "Here, I almost forgot." She handed Nancy the names of the 3 persons who had written letters of recommendation for the houseman. "If you don't mind," said Nancy, "I'll phone these men after breakfast." An hour later, she came down from the second-floor phone and reported to the Cornings in the living room. "Well, what did they say?" asked the old gentleman. "None of these people ever heard of Morgan." The couple sat thunderstruck. "Then the letters were forged," said Mrs. Corning. "I'm afraid so," Nancy told her. "Impossible!" snorted Mr. Corning. "I remember talking to one of those men on the telephone." "You must have spoken to an imposter," said Nancy. But why would Morgan do this?" asked Mrs. Corning. "Maybe his past made it impossible for him to get recommendations any other way," said Nancy. "Whoever helped him must feel he has a hold over Morgan. Perhaps that is the friend who has come back into his life." Mrs. Corning said presently, "Now that Morgan has returned, maybe it's all over." "I doubt it," said Nancy. "He's still frightened." Her host spoke up. "Morgan's always been honest and a hard worker. I say we give him another chance. Do you agree, Emily?" His wife nodded. The girls said nothing. After church and lunch, Nancy looked through the advertising pages of the telephone directory for fireworks companies in the area, but found none. As she put the book away, There was a sharp knock on the door. Nancy went to open it. No one was there, but on the stoop was a long, narrow parcel wrapped in brown paper. It was addressed to Morgan. Suspicious. Nancy went to tell the Cornings about it. "Under the circumstances," she said, "would you like to open this before Morgan does?" "No," her hostess said firmly. "I feel that what's Morgan's business is his business. Take the parcel to him, Nancy." With misgivings, she carried the package to the kitchen and handed it to the houseman. He stared at it and began to tremble. With shaking fingers, Morgan removed the string and paper. He seemed lost in thought and unaware that Nancy was still in the room. When Morgan opened the paper and saw the contents, his face turned white and he suddenly slumped to the floor. In the package lay a few stalks of blue larkspur. End of chapter 10.